13 Brutal Facts About Traveling the Old West in a Covered Wagon. Welcome back to Past Not Past, where forgotten stories come alive. Today we're hitching a ride on a covered wagon, straight into the heart of the American frontier. Sure, you might remember the Oregon Trail game, or those classic westerns with sun-drenched plains and noble pioneers. But behind the romance lies a grittier truth. Life on the trail was no joyride. It was raw, relentless, and often heartbreaking. So before we let nostalgia take the reins, let's uncover 13 brutal realities of life on the trail. What did it truly cost to chase the American dream out west? Let's find out together. Hi everyone, it's me from Past Not Past, and I've got a quick update. This channel's having some tech issues, so we'll only post here once or twice a week. But good news. We've launched a brand new channel where we're now uploading 1 to 3 videos every day, full of the same nostalgic stories you love. Check out the link below, hit subscribe, and let's keep the memories alive, together. Months of misery. The first harsh truth, and perhaps the foundation for all other difficulties, was the terrifyingly long travel time. Traveling by covered wagon was not fast at all. Even on the best days with flat terrain and favorable weather, a covered wagon might go about 20 miles. That was the ideal scenario, folks. More often, they only traveled between 8 and 20 miles per day. Rough terrain, treacherous mountain passes, or bad weather all could slow down the wagon train, sometimes to a crawl. Try to imagine, starting from St. Louis, a common departure point for trips west. The straight-line distance to San Francisco is about 1,750 miles. Even at the optimal 20 miles a day, theoretically it would take nearly 90 days to cover that distance. But that was just theory. In reality, wagon trains rarely maintained that speed. There were constant delays, broken wheels, livestock got sick or exhausted, the weather turned bad, the terrain was too difficult. And more importantly, the actual trails were much longer than the crow flies. They wound around obstacles through valleys and over mountains, adding hundreds, even thousands of miles. The result? A trip from St. Louis to the West Coast often took about 6 months. 6 months of grueling journey, enduring all the harshness of the weather, with extremely limited food and comforts. It was a terrible test of endurance. People got sick, got injured, and sometimes even died along the way. Reaching the West Coast was an extraordinary achievement, a testament to the incredible resilience and determination of the pioneers. They paid a very high price in time and hardship just to have a chance to start a new life. 6 months living in a state of near existence, not life. Really hard to imagine, isn't it? Your home was a bone-jarring box. Now let's talk about their actual mode of transportation, the covered wagon. We see them romantically in movies, but what about reality? The most iconic type was the prairie schooner. With its curved wooden bows creating a rounded roof and covered with canvas, from a distance it looked like a ship's sail gliding on the sea of the prairie. This wagon was like the 19th century minivan, used to carry the whole family and their possessions. There was another type, the Conestoga wagon, larger and heavier, often pulled by larger teams of animals. But its size and weight made it unsuitable for long cross-country treks. The Conestoga was better suited for shorter trips, hauling freight between cities or to nearby territories. Regardless of the type, travel in these wagons was incredibly challenging. Forget smooth paved roads. Pioneers followed rough trails, often just deeply rutted paths. Bad weather could turn them into muddy quagmires. And here's the kicker. These wagons had absolutely no suspension system. The wheels and axles were made of rigid wood without any cushioning whatsoever. Every little rock, every deep rut on the trail created jarring bounces transmitted straight to the wagon bed. Passengers were tossed around constantly, hour after hour, day after day, just constant bouncing. It felt like you were sitting in a wooden box and being violently shaken by someone with no end in sight. Surprisingly, the prairie schooner was even considered smoother than the Conestoga wagon. While larger and carried more, its size made it more prone to tipping. Many trails weren't wide enough for the Conestoga, and its wheels would often slide off the trail, leading to a bone-jarring experience. To escape the constant bouncing, many pioneers chose to walk beside their covered wagons. But imagine folks walking hundreds, even thousands of miles over that rough terrain. It was incredibly exhausting and left them completely exposed to the elements. So it was a brutal choice: endure the brutal bumpy ride or the exhausting walk. Neither was easy, and that says a lot about the hardships pioneers faced on the journey west. Sitting was miserable, walking was miserable. There were no comfortable options. No room at the inn or the wagon. With a canvas cover, it's easy to picture pioneer families gathering cozy inside the covered wagon at night, right? It seems like a natural shelter after a long day, but the reality was quite different. Those prairie schooners were filled with all the family's possessions. Every inch of space was utilized to the maximum, and the space inside wasn't large to begin with, only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. Imagine a queen-size bed, and then picture packing all your worldly goods into it. There simply wasn't enough room for people to sleep inside. So, most nights, families slept outside. They might lay blankets on the ground or set up a makeshift tent using canvas and poles. This offered only minimal protection from the elements. They were fully exposed to the blazing sun by day, freezing temperatures by night, sudden rain showers, and wind. And if the weather turned truly nasty, they'd have to shelter under the wagon, trying to find any refuge they could, even if it meant sleeping on hard dirt. This made for uncomfortable and often restless nights. Definitely not a recipe for good sleep. And yes, it probably did a number on their backs after months of sleeping on the ground. Waking up sore was likely unavoidable. Feeling damp, cold, or hot lingered all night. Trail cuisine and an unexpected fuel source. Okay, you're on the trail heading west in your covered wagon. You've packed your goods, tools, everything needed for a new life. But what about food? You couldn't exactly stop at a grocery store on the Oregon Trail, could you? As we just mentioned, prairie schooners were filled with household goods not ready to eat meals. So how did they survive and keep their families fed on their 6-month journey? That's where the chuck wagon came in. This was the mobile kitchen of the wagon train. Similar in size to a prairie schooner, but specifically outfitted for preparing and storing food. It played an essential role in feeding the families on their long trek. The chuck wagon had a water barrel attached to the side, providing easy access to fresh water throughout the day. Many had coffee grinders, offering a much-needed caffeine boost after a tiring day of travel. Underneath the chuck wagon was the possum belly, a storage compartment for firewood and, interestingly, dried cow dung, also known as cow chips. Yes, you heard that right. On the vast treeless prairies, dried cow dung became a valuable source of fuel for cooking fires. It burned slowly and provided enough heat for simple meals. This shows the incredible resourcefulness and adaptability of the pioneers. Each evening, the chuck wagon became the heart of the camp. Families gathered as cooks prepared simple meals like beans, bacon, and biscuits. It was a time to share stories, build community, a welcome moment of rest after a long day on the trail. The chuck wagon wasn't just a place to cook. It was a symbol of ingenuity and community spirit, essential for the survival and morale of the entire train on their journey west. Sitting down, eating a hot meal, however simple, after a grueling day must have been incredibly precious. Mules and oxen, not horses. We often associate the Wild West with horses and skilled riders. True, many Native American tribes were master horsemen, using horses for hunting, warfare, and travel. The U.S. Army and explorers also relied heavily on horses. But one group was largely excluded from this horse culture: the settlers. For most pioneer families, owning a horse was simply too expensive. Horses were costly to acquire and required significant expense for feeding and care. Settlers were already stretched thin, buying their covered wagons, supplies, and food for the journey. A horse was a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, they relied on mules and oxen. These sturdy animals were much more practical for the journey west. Unlike horses, mules and oxen could survive on a rough forage found along the trail, making feeding easier and cheaper. They were also stronger and more durable, capable of pulling heavy-laden wagons across vast distances and challenging terrain. Mules, known for their sure-footedness, were especially useful in mountain regions. Oxen, though slower, were incredibly strong and reliable, ideal for pulling heavy loads over long stretches. They became the primary work animals on the western trails. Upon arrival, settlers continued to rely on their mules and oxen for farming and other work. These animals became essential to building their new lives. Horses, perhaps flashier, simply weren't practical for the average pioneer family. Their dependence on mules and oxen showed the resourcefulness and practicality that were hallmarks of the westward expansion. These quiet work animals were truly the heroes pulling a new civilization west. The canvas cover was little protection. You'd think at least the canvas cover would protect folks and goods from the harsh weather, right? Reality. It's much more complex. Weather was a constant challenge for pioneers crossing the western trails. The prairie schooners with their canvas tops did offer some shelter, but not much. The reason was the canvas itself was not waterproof initially. Settlers had to treat it to make it resistant to the elements. They started with thick cotton canvas, often around 10 ounces. Then they would coat it with a layer of linseed oil. This created a water barrier, protecting the family's belongings from light rain and snow. Once treated, the canvas was carefully draped over the wagon frame and secured. But even treated canvas wasn't perfect. On the vast prairie, wind was a relentless factor. Rain rarely fell straight down. Strong winds could blow rain sideways right under the canvas cover. And when it wasn't raining, the wind often kicked up clouds of dust and sand, whipping at the wagon and getting into every crevice. The feeling of dust and sand getting in your eyes, nose, mouth, clinging to clothes and possessions must have been incredibly uncomfortable. To combat this, settlers added a drawstring to the edges of the canvas. This allowed them to pull the cover tightly, creating a more enclosed space like a giant hood for their wagon. It helped keep out wind, blowing rain, and dust, providing a bit more protection against the harsh elements. But even with these precautions, severe weather was a constant threat. A sudden storm could render all efforts useless. Breakdown miles from anywhere. Picture this. You're traveling cross-country in a covered wagon, miles from any sign of civilization. Suddenly something breaks. No paved roads, no repair garages, no tow trucks. Just you, your broken wagon, and the vast wilderness. This was the reality for pioneers. Breakdowns were a frequent threat. The rough trails were absolutely brutal on the wooden wagons. Wooden wheels cracked and splintered on rocks and difficult terrain. Axles snapped under the weight and stress. Metal parts wore down and broke off, and when something broke, you were entirely on your own. So, pioneers packed their wagons with essential tools: hammers, saws, axes, nails, anything they might need to make repairs. They also carried spare parts because they knew that wagon breakdowns were inevitable. But sometimes, even the best preparation wasn't enough. They had to improvise using whatever materials they could find to make repairs. A sturdy tree branch, a piece of animal hide, or whatever could work temporarily. A broken wagon meant the entire train had to stop. Families had to unload everything from the wagon, a grueling task in harsh conditions. Often, they even had to tip the wagon on its side to access the underside for repairs. All of this while still facing the elements, wildlife, and other potential dangers. Each successful repair was a hard-won victory, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. They were their own mechanics, relying on their skills and resourcefulness to overcome these constant challenges. The pressure to fix it yourself, because otherwise the whole train would slow down or leave you behind, must have been immense. Treacherous river crossings. Sooner or later, every pioneer family heading west had to face river crossings. While much of the west was arid, rivers and streams still cut across the landscape, posing a serious challenge. These crossings were difficult for everyone: the families, their livestock, and the wagons themselves. Sometimes on larger rivers there would be ferry services, but ferries were not cheap, and most settlers couldn't afford them. That meant they had to ford the river, drive the wagon train right through the water, a very risky proposition. On smaller rivers, pioneers often had to improvise, building rafts out of whatever materials they could find. If they were lucky, there were trees nearby. They could lash logs together to create a makeshift ferry. The crucial factor was finding the right spot to cross. They needed a narrow stretch of river with a quiet current. Finding this spot could take hours, even days, while the weather could change at any moment. Once a viable spot was found, they would try to waterproof the wagon bed, coating it with wax and sealing any cracks. The covered wagon now became a type of boat, a very fragile boat. Then, with the oxen straining to pull, they would slowly push the wagon into the current. A successful river crossing was a huge relief, but it was always a gamble. If the current was too strong or the wagon too heavy, it could easily tip over, spilling everything into the river. Livestock could be swept away. People could be injured or even drown. River crossings were tense, dangerous moments, a stark reminder of the perils of the journey west. The fear, the extreme tension of pushing the wagon into the water, not knowing what would happen, must have been a terrifying experience for everyone, from young children to old adults. The real killers, disease and accidents. So, how dangerous was the Oregon Trail, really? It's hard to give precise numbers. Like the total number of emigrants, the number of deaths is difficult to pinpoint. Estimates vary quite a bit. Some historians put the mortality rate at around 4 to 6% of all travelers. That translates to about 12,000 to 24,000 deaths. Other estimates go up to 10%. What were the biggest dangers? It was accidents and disease. Pioneer diaries frequently mention gun accidents, injuries from encounters with wildlife, drowning, like during river crossings, and death from exposure to the cold. Wagon accidents were also common, and tragically, children were sometimes killed or severely injured after falling under moving wheels. Life on the trail was precarious. Death was a frequent companion, a stark reminder of the risks pioneers faced on the journey west. But the biggest killer, the most terrifying invisible enemy, was disease. Sanitation was a massive challenge. Opportunities to bathe or wash clothes were rare, and clean drinking water was often scarce. Human and animal waste, along with garbage and dead animal carcasses, often contaminated water sources along the trail. Cholera, a waterborne illness, was the biggest killer overall. Diphtheria, another dangerous infectious disease, was the leading cause of death in children. Exhaustion from the long journey and poor nutrition also made pioneers susceptible to other illnesses like typhoid, mountain fever, possibly tick-borne, dysentery, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, food poisoning, scurvy, lack of vitamin C, and alkali poisoning from contaminated water. Measles, mumps, and smallpox also took a heavy toll, especially on children. Childbirth on the trail also posed serious risks for women. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor illnesses could quickly become life-threatening. Disease was a constant fear, and its presence cast a long shadow over the journey west. It's hard to imagine the helplessness of watching a loved one fall ill with nothing you could do. The truth about Native American encounters. Now, let's talk about an aspect often heavily misunderstood in Western movies. We often see images of wagon trains circling up for defense against Native American attacks. But in reality, conflict with Native Americans was relatively rare during the peak years of the Oregon Trail. Historian John Unruh's research indicates that fewer than 400 emigrants were killed in Native American attacks between 1840 and 1860. Deaths from disease accidents versus deaths from Native American conflict. Compared to the tens of thousands who died from sickness and accidents, this number shows that Native American attacks, while terrifying when they happened, were not the primary danger. More often than not, interactions between pioneers and Native Americans were peaceful, even helpful. Native Americans often traded supplies with pioneers, operated ferry services, or assisted with managing livestock. While wagon trains did often circle up at night, the primary purpose of this was to corral their livestock, not for defense against attacks. In the rare instances attacks did occur, the wagon train was usually in marching formation, not circled for defense. The Hollywood image of constant conflict does not reflect the more complex and nuanced reality of life on the Oregon Trail. Sadly, many conflicts that did happen between pioneers and Native Americans were often provoked by the pioneers themselves. Cultural misunderstanding, arrogance, and violent actions towards Native Americans, such as random shootings, sometimes provoked retaliation. And often this retaliation didn't target the specific group who caused the incident, but rather the next wagon train that came along. After the 1850s, attacks on smaller wagon trains or individual travelers did increase. This rise in violence reflected the growing hostility of Native Americans towards white settlers who were increasingly encroaching on their lands. The relationship between pioneers and Native Americans was complex and often tense, and the increasing pressure of westward expansion exacerbated these tensions. Understanding this gives us a fuller, fairer picture of this complicated history. Arrival was not always the end of hardship. After 6 long months facing countless dangers from terrain, weather, disease, and accidents, they finally saw their destination. The feeling of relief and happiness must have been immeasurable. But the final harsh truth on this list is, arrival wasn't always a happy ending. Many pioneers arrived in dire straits. Some had run out of food and were starving. Others were sick and exhausted after the long journey. Many were destitute, having lost their wagon, their possessions, or spent their last dollars on fees along the way. Imagine, after everything they went through, after surviving sickness, accidents, river crossings, fixing wagons in the wilderness, they reached the promised land, with nothing left, utterly depleted, starving, and sick. The dream of a new life seemed still very far away. Fortunately, earlier Oregon settlers often organized relief efforts. Generous settlers would form supply trains and meet the newcomers at the Dalles, a significant location at the end of the Oregon Trail, providing much-needed supplies and assistance for their final stretch. This help was often the difference between life and death for those who had endured so much to reach their destination. While the journey west was grueling, it also revealed the compassion and generosity of those who had been through the difficult journey themselves and were willing to share with those who came after. The moment of receiving help when utterly depleted must have been incredibly touching. Why they pushed on, motivation and consequences. After hearing all those harsh truths, one big question remains. Why did they do it? What drove hundreds of thousands of people to take such terrible risks and endure such unbelievable hardship? It's truly admirable how those pioneers persevered towards the West, despite the horrifying hardships they faced. The dream of a better life, the opportunity to own their own piece of land, that's what fueled their determination. Entire families, from grandparents to young children, embarked on these arduous journeys hoping for a new start. They were the driving force behind westward expansion, opening up a new era for the United States. However, this chapter of American history isn't just about the story of pioneer resilience and determination. This westward expansion also brought devastating consequences for Native Americans. As settlers claimed the land, Native American tribes were displaced and confined to reservations. Their way of life was changed forever, often in a tragic way. This is a part of the history that cannot be ignored when talking about the trail. This era was shaped by the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand its territory across the continent. And so it happened, reaching all the way to the Pacific. The frontier was opened, leading to industrial development and technological advancements like the Transcontinental Railroad. By the late 1800s, cross-country travel had become significantly easier, but it was those early pioneers in their covered wagons who had opened the way. Their journey was incredibly difficult, full of hard labor and constant danger. Many did not survive. Their story is one of incredible resilience and determination, but also one of loss and displacement for another people. It's a complex and important part of American history. The trail's enduring legacy. The driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory, Utah in 1869, completing the first transcontinental railroad, signaled a major shift in westward migration. The era of the great overland trails was coming to a close. However, the Oregon Trail itself evolved over the decades. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought a massive influx of 49ers, changing the trail and the communities around it. The 1850s saw an increased military presence along the route, along with physical improvements like ferries and bridges. Steamboats began operating on the Columbia River, offering an alternative to wagon travel for part of the journey. The 1860s brought even more changes. Settlements grew larger and more populated. Communication improved with the Pony Express and later the Transcontinental Telegraph. Stagecoach lines expanded, offering faster travel options. The Oregon Trail, once a remote and challenging path, was becoming increasingly integrated into a rapidly changing nation. The railroad might have marked the end of an era, but the Oregon Trail had undergone significant transformation before that. New communication and transportation technologies often followed the established routes of the Oregon Trail. Telegraph lines were strung along the trail, and railroad tracks were sometimes laid directly over its path. While the railroad didn't immediately eliminate wagon travel, it significantly reduced the need for it. Of all the Western trails, the Oregon Trail remained in use the longest, partly because the railroad didn't reach Oregon until the early 1880s. Even after railroads replaced most wagon traffic, the Oregon Trail continued to serve another purpose. It became a major route for driving cattle and sheep eastward to market. The trail, once the path of westward expansion, now facilitated a different kind of movement, connecting the growing West with established markets in the East. The Oregon Trail, while no longer the primary route for Western migration, continued to play a role in the developing American economy. The Oregon Trail, as a continuous traversable route as it once was, no longer exists. But its legacy remains. Traces of the trail are still visible today, offering glimpses into this important chapter of American history. In many places, you can still see deep ruts carved into the ground by thousands of covered wagons. Near Guernsey, Wyoming, these ruts are particularly striking, cut up to 5 feet deep into the sandstone. Imagine the countless wagons that passed over this very spot, carrying hopeful pioneers westward. Names and dates carved into soft sandstone blocks, like at Independence Rock, still bear witness to the passage of these travelers. These inscriptions, made over a century ago, offer a personal connection to the pioneers who made this arduous journey. Many landmarks along the trail are now protected areas. Scotts Bluff National Monument and Chimney Rock National Historic Site preserve iconic rock formations that guided and inspired generations of pioneers. Historic forts such as Forts Bridger, Kearney, Laramie, and Vancouver, along with sites like Whitman Mission, offer further insight into life on the trail. These preserved sites allow us to connect with the past, providing a tangible link to the pioneers who blazed the trail west, shaping the nation we know today. Recognizing the importance of the Oregon Trail, the U.S. Congress established the Oregon National Historic Trail in 1978. The goal is to preserve and protect the remnants of the trail and provide public access where possible. The National Park Service oversees the trail, coordinating with the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies. Several interpretive centers along the route offer visitors a deeper understanding of the trail's history and significance. The Oregon Trail also connects with other National Park Service sites, offering a broader perspective on westward expansion, exploring themes of settlement, natural history, and challenges. By preserving and interpreting these sites, we gain a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices and triumphs of those who traveled the Oregon Trail, shaping the American West and the nation. The Oregon Trail didn't just leave its mark on the landscape, it also became a part of popular culture. Several films have depicted the trail and its challenges. In 1977, there was even a TV miniseries called The Oregon Trail. But perhaps the most famous portrayal of the Oregon Trail is the educational video game. Wildly popular in the 1980s and 90s, the game introduced generations of students to the hardships and adventure of westward migration. And it's not just a relic of the past. The Oregon Trail game has been re-released in various digital formats, ensuring that new generations can experience this interactive journey into history. From film to television to video games, the Oregon Trail continues to capture our imagination, reminding us of the pioneers who bravely faced the unknown to forge a new life in the West. How do you feel after hearing these facts? What surprised you the most? Or if you ever played the Oregon Trail game, what from the game do you remember most, and how does it compare or contrast with the reality we just explored? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. What pioneers ate on the Oregon Trail? Do you remember hearing stories about our ancestors braving the wild frontier, traveling over 2,000 rugged miles in nothing but a covered wagon? The Oregon Trail wasn't just a road. It was a real test of courage and sheer determination. Facing hunger, sickness, and endless uncertainty, those pioneers relied on clever tricks just to put food on the table. Sometimes even baking bread with wild bacteria or cooking over buffalo chips. Today, let's take a step back in time and discover what truly fed the adventurers who shaped history. Johnny cakes. Among all the foods that kept pioneers moving along the Oregon Trail, few were as beloved or relied upon as the humble Johnny cake. These simple cornmeal cakes, sometimes called hoe cakes or Indian meal cakes, were a mainstay in the daily diet of travelers for good reason. They were easy to prepare, filling, and could be made with just a handful of affordable ingredients. Johnny cakes were so popular throughout the 18th and 19th centuries that you'd find them in kitchens and campfires from New England to the far reaches of the frontier. To really appreciate how central these cakes were, consider recipes found in guides like the Farmer and Emigrant's Handbook from 1856. The ingredients list was short and practical. Fine cornmeal as the base, a spoonful of molasses for a hint of sweetness, a dash of salt, a little butter, and importantly, some bacon fat for frying. Not only did the bacon grease prevent sticking, but it also gave each Johnny cake a smoky, savory flavor that made even the simplest meal feel special. The cook would mix the cornmeal, molasses, salt, and butter, then gradually add boiling water to reach just the right consistency. Not too dry, but not runny either. Shaped by hand, the cakes were carefully fried in the hot bacon fat over a campfire, cooked until brown on both sides over a hot fire. Paired with crispy bacon and a steaming mug of coffee, Johnny cakes gave pioneers a reliable source of energy and comfort, helping them face whatever challenges the trail threw their way. Johnny cakes recipe. Let's step back in time and whip up a true pioneer breakfast. Johnny cakes with bacon, just like those hardy travelers enjoyed. To start, you'll want to gather your ingredients. 2 cups of fine cornmeal, a tablespoon of molasses to lend a touch of sweetness, a teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter, and some boiling water. For frying, you'll need some hot grease, and the most authentic way to get that is by cooking bacon first. Not only does this provide the perfect non-stick base, but it also adds a rich, smoky taste to every cake. Begin by frying the bacon in a skillet until it reaches your preferred level of crispiness. Then set the strips aside, making sure to keep that savory fat in the pan. In a mixing bowl, combine the cornmeal, molasses, salt, and butter. Using your hands to thoroughly blend everything together, slowly pour in boiling water, a little at a time, stirring as you go. The water amount will affect how soft or firm your cakes are. About 3/4 of a cup gives you a denser cake, while a little extra makes them softer. You'll want a dough that's easy to shape but not too wet. Mold the mixture into small, round cakes with your hands and carefully place them in the sizzling bacon fat. Johnny cakes won't give you bubbles like pancakes, so watch closely for that golden color before flipping. About 3 minutes per side depending on your pan's heat and the cake size. Once they're browned on both sides, serve your Johnny cakes hot, alongside that crispy bacon, and enjoy a classic, comforting meal worthy of the Oregon Trail. Packing for the Oregon Trail. Imagine standing at the edge of a new life in the 1850s, preparing to leave the familiar comforts of the East for the wild unknown of Oregon. Your journey would begin in places like Independence, Missouri, where thousands of pioneers assembled to gather supplies and load up their wagons. Unlike the oversized Conestoga wagons often pictured in movies, most families used lighter, more practical prairie schooners, mobile homes for the 4 to 6 months it would take to reach the western frontier. Packing was both an art and a science, and survival depended on making smart choices about what to bring. Previous travelers had left plenty of advice behind, and a typical recommendation for a family of 3 included a hefty supply of flour, around 5 barrels or over 1,000 pounds, along with 600 pounds of bacon. Coffee was considered almost as essential as food, so 100 pounds of it found its way into most wagons. To round out the diet, pioneers packed tea, sugar, rice, and dried fruit for both nutrition and variety. Seasonings were also crucial, with salt and pepper topping the list, and up to 50 pounds of each stowed away to make otherwise bland meals more palatable. Baking soda, known then as saleratus, was carried for making bread, and lard was packed by the 100-pound barrel for cooking and preserving. Beans and cornmeal were staple items, and the ever-reliable hardtack, rough, long-lasting crackers, was stored by the barrel for emergencies. Packing essentials, food hacks, and the pitfalls of overpacking. Preparing for the Oregon Trail meant thinking like an engineer, a chef, and a survivalist all at once. Beyond basic foodstuffs, pioneers needed to find clever ways to keep supplies fresh and organized. Many brought along a milk cow for a steady supply of fresh milk and butter, and chickens to provide eggs during the long journey. These animals offered crucial nutrition and added variety to otherwise monotonous meals. To keep everything tidy and protected, pioneers packed their food in barrels and, more commonly, in sturdy, stackable provision boxes. These boxes served a dual purpose. They doubled as makeshift furniture, quickly transforming into tables or chairs around a campfire. With storage space at a premium, every item had to justify its weight, yet staying organized was essential for morale and efficiency on the trail. One of the greatest challenges was preventing perishable items like bacon or lard from spoiling in the heat and sun. Resourceful travelers often buried these foods inside barrels of flour or cornmeal. This simple trick shielded them from direct sunlight and extended their shelf life for most of the journey, helping ensure there'd be something edible at the end of each long day. However, packing wasn't just about what you brought, but also what you left behind. Despite all the warnings and guidebooks, many newcomers overestimated what was truly necessary, stuffing their wagons with every imaginable item, from delicate trinkets and musical instruments to extra clothes and even sewing machines. It didn't take long before the realities of rough travel made their mistakes clear. Within weeks, the trail was littered with abandoned goods, as families lightened their loads to keep their oxen moving. What surprised you most about pioneer life? Was it the meals, the hardships, or something else? Hunting and gathering on the trail. No matter how carefully families packed their wagons, the grueling pace of the Oregon Trail meant supplies would eventually run low. That's why supplementing the pantry with fresh food along the way was a crucial part of every pioneer's strategy. Each day, travelers covered 15 to 20 miles on foot, burning through calories fast, so finding extra nourishment wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely necessary. Early in the trail's history, there were no general stores or trading posts for easy resupply. But by the 1850s, a few forts, such as Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, began offering some goods, though at extremely high prices, sometimes costing 5 times more than back in Missouri. When faced with inflated prices or empty shelves, most families chose the more challenging but rewarding path of hunting and foraging. Pioneers learned from Native American tribes and quickly adapted to the land. They dug up wild onions, garlic, and the nutrient-rich camas root, which was a staple for local tribes. These roots would be roasted or steamed in pits, then dried for future use. Fishing was an option if the wagon train passed a river, though luck and skill were required. Sometimes families even traded sugar or other prized items for fresh fish from friendly locals or other travelers. Hunting small animals like prairie dogs, rabbits, ducks, geese, and sage hens became a routine part of trail life. Foraging and hunting brought much-needed protein and variety to the monotonous diet of bacon and hardtack, Even so, the unpredictability of the wilderness meant some days were feast, others famine. Game meat. While dried goods and forage plants provided some sustenance, it was game meat that often made the difference between going hungry and feeling satisfied on the Oregon Trail. The open prairies and woodlands offered a variety of wild animals that pioneers could hunt, providing not just food, but a crucial morale boost after days of bland rations. Hunting was both a skill and a necessity, and those who knew how to use a rifle or set a trap were highly valued in every wagon party. Small animals were the most common targets. Prairie dogs, rabbits, ducks, geese, and sage hens often ended up in the stew pot. Some pioneers developed a taste for prairie dog, which was surprisingly fatty, while others found sage hen soup with dumplings to be a comforting meal, though not everyone appreciated the strong, herbal flavor that mountain sage gave the meat. Each successful hunt brought welcome variety to the otherwise monotonous trail diet. For a more substantial and longer-lasting supply, the pioneers hunted larger animals like antelope, and most famously the American buffalo. Bringing down a buffalo was an event for the entire wagon train, as one or two animals provided an enormous quantity of meat. The real challenge, however, was preserving all that fresh meat before it spoiled. To solve this, pioneers cut the meat into long, thin strips and hung them around the wagons to dry in the sun and wind, turning it into jerky. The sight of wagons adorned with drying meat became a familiar one on the trail. Buffalo chips. With few trees in sight for hundreds of miles, firewood became a rare luxury, forcing travelers to get creative with what nature provided. The solution came from the vast herds of buffalo that once roamed the prairies. Their dried droppings, commonly called buffalo chips. At first glance, collecting buffalo chips might sound unpleasant, but for those making the trek west, it was a matter of survival. These sun-baked discs were surprisingly effective as fuel, burning hot and steady with little smoke or odor. Gathering chips became part of the daily routine. After the wagon stopped for the night, you could see women and children spread across the prairie, burlap sacks in hand, stooping to gather the day's supply. Some wore gloves, but many used bare hands, undeterred by the task's earthy reality. Buffalo chips were used for cooking everything from bacon and johnny cakes to pots of beans and stews. With no other options available, they kept the fire going for warmth and meals, and their reliability became legendary among those who'd made the crossing. Despite the oddness, using buffalo chips as fuel became second nature to the pioneers. In a land where every resource counted, nothing was wasted, not even what the buffalo left behind. Their willingness to adapt to such challenges speaks volumes about the grit and ingenuity that defined life on the Oregon Trail, turning even the most unlikely materials into the means for survival. Cooking on the trail. For pioneers, preparing meals along the Oregon Trail was a daily test of patience and creativity. With limited supplies and primitive tools, they had to make the most out of what little they had, turning basic ingredients into filling, if unremarkable, food. Most families brought a handful of essential cookware: a heavy frying pan, a sturdy Dutch oven for baking and stewing, a kettle or coffee pot, and tin plates and cups for serving. Some, if they had room, packed reflector ovens to bake simple cakes or pies, making trail life a touch more civilized. Bread was a staple and could be baked in several ways depending on available ingredients. Baking soda, known as saleratus, was common, but some pioneers used the newer Preston's yeast powder, while others relied on age-old ingenuity to create salt-rising bread. This unique loaf used wild bacteria instead of commercial yeast, allowing dough to rise even when fresh yeast was impossible to find. The process required patience and luck with the weather, but it was one of many clever adaptations along the journey. Desserts weren't unheard of either. When supplies allowed, pioneers baked apple pies, pound cakes, and even peach or berry pies if wild fruit could be found. Dried apples were common, though not universally loved. One saying went, "Spit in my ears and tell me lies, but give me no dried apple pies." Even with simple ingredients, these treats offered welcome comfort and a break from the monotony of salt pork and beans. Cooking was often done over fires fueled by buffalo chips. the open flame lending a smoky flavor to nearly every dish. Despite the challenges and repetition, the act of cooking together and eating as a group brought a sense of normalcy and morale to those enduring the hardships of the trail. Thank you for watching. Comment 1 to let us know you're still following. 4th of July Feast. Among the many meals eaten along the Oregon Trail, none stood out quite like the 4th of July Feast. This wasn't just a patriotic celebration, it often marked the symbolic halfway point of their grueling journey west. That milestone was all the excuse they needed to break out whatever special supplies they'd been saving for a rare moment of indulgence. In his 1849 account, William Swain painted a picture of an extravagant Independence Day meal, especially by trail standards. Their holiday table was loaded with ham, beans cooked several different ways, flaky biscuits, johnny cake, sweet cake, apple pie, rice pudding, and even delicacies like pickles and mustard. Coffee, sugar, and milk rounded out the meal, turning an ordinary day into a genuine feast. Of course, it wouldn't have been a real celebration without a few brandy toasts. According to Swain, the men grew a bit too enthusiastic, carrying on with their drinks until good sense gave way to the effects of brandy. Swain himself claimed to have bowed out after the 5th toast, choosing to spend the rest of his day writing letters home rather than joining the continued revelry. Not every wagon train was so fortunate. By the time the 4th arrived, some groups found their luxury rations already depleted. George Keller remembered a far less appetizing meal of stale hardtack and beef bones nearly gone bad. Amos Steck recalled trudging through sand with only poor quality hardtack for lunch, feeling little of the holiday spirit. These sparse meals were especially common in all-male groups, where domestic skills were in short supply. Many, like James Hutchings, admitted wishing they'd learned more from the women back home, a testament to just how vital women's cooking and care were for the well-being of everyone on the trail. Camp sacrifice. No matter how skilled you were at cooking, there eventually came a point on the Oregon Trail when it didn't make much difference. Supplies simply ran out the further you traveled. Pioneers watched as every special treat brought from home slowly disappeared from their wagons. Soon all that remained were the bare basics: sacks of flour, slabs of bacon, beans, a little sugar, and tea. As one traveler put it, all of the little delicacies we brought with us from home were gone, and we had nothing left but flour, bacon, beans, sugar, and tea. And like the children of Israel, my soul loathed this food, and I longed for something fresh. The farther we traveled, the more meager became our fare. The sameness wore down both body and spirit. At this stage, the pioneers grew dependent on hard-wearing foods like buffalo jerky and hardtack. The daily rhythm of chewing through these tough, uninspiring rations was sometimes broken by portable soup, an inventive trail solution. To make it, pioneers boiled down meat and bones for hours until a thick, gelatinous layer formed at the bottom of the pot. Once dried and cut into squares, these pieces could be stored for weeks and later dissolved in water to make a simple soup, much like an early bouillon cube. There was also meat biscuit, a concentrated food that was said to pack the nutrition of 5 pounds of fresh beef into just 1 pound. Packed tightly in tin containers, meat biscuits could last indefinitely and provided an instant meal. With appetites growing and tempers shortening, the highlight of each day was still mealtime, even if breakfast was eaten in the middle of a snowstorm. The food might have been crusted in snow instead of sugar, but everyone tucked in with gusto, proof that even meager meals could lift spirits on the harsh, endless prairie. Lemon extract and aluminum ammonium sulfate. As the wagons rolled further west, pioneers faced a new set of obstacles. Their supply of lemon extract, a small but precious comfort, began to run out. Many travelers had relied on a splash of lemon extract and a spoonful of sugar to transform muddy, foul-tasting water into a crude lemonade. This little trick didn't just make water more drinkable. It also offered a momentary escape from the unrelenting dust that coated nearly everything on the plains, food and water included. Clean water was never guaranteed on the trail. When rivers or streams looked especially questionable, Pioneers sometimes tried to purify the water with aluminum ammonium sulfate, a chemical that helped settle out impurities. Unfortunately, while this method removed some dirt, it left the water with a harsh, unpleasant flavor that was hard to ignore. When those supplies ran out, pioneers turned to yet another resourceful hack, adding a scoop of cornmeal to the water. They'd let it sit for half an hour or so, allowing the cornmeal to sink and take some of the grime with it, resulting in water that was at least a bit clearer, even if it still tasted far from fresh. As food became more scarce and the last luxury items vanished, the hardships multiplied. Approaching Fort Laramie, nicknamed Camp Sacrifice, brought its own set of challenges. This was the final major stop before facing the daunting Rocky Mountains. Here, the real cost of weight became clear. Wagons had to be made lighter, and tough decisions followed, not only discarding non-essentials like books and china, but sometimes even abandoning food and tools. One group, desperate to make it over the mountains, left behind a literal ton of bacon, barrels of bread, and expensive equipment worth a small fortune, all for a better chance at survival. Guidebooks and other practical documents. To navigate the daunting expanse of the Oregon Trail, pioneers relied not just on grit and instinct, but also on a growing library of guidebooks and practical manuals. As more and more wagon trains ventured west, these handbooks became essential reading, offering crucial information for anyone hoping to reach Oregon safely. Among the most influential was Lansford Hastings' The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, first published in 1845. Mormons often depended on William Clayton's The Latter-day Saints' Emigrant's Guide, which offered distances, best camping spots, and other vital advice. These books were filled with tips on how to pack a wagon, where to find grazing land for livestock, and what rivers to avoid. They even advised on the best places to rest, the safest river crossings, and the types of food to bring. The most thorough guides broke down the route mile by mile, warning travelers of upcoming dangers, such as stretches without water or regions known for disease. Some handbooks suggested how to lighten your load, what medicines to bring, and how to treat common illnesses on the trail. Pioneers would often consult these documents each night by campfire, planning the next day's route and making decisions about rationing supplies or adjusting their pace. Still, not all advice proved reliable. Some guides contained optimistic shortcuts or underestimated the perils ahead, leading to confusion and even disaster for the less experienced. As the Oregon Trail became more popular, guidebooks grew increasingly sophisticated, often including hand-drawn maps, detailed lists, and personal anecdotes. These documents became treasured companions, passed from hand to hand, dog-eared and smudged with the dust of the plains, reflecting the hard-won knowledge of those who'd already blazed the way to the western frontier. Which pioneer food would you actually try, and which would you run from? Share your thoughts below. The dangers of the journey. The journey stretched a daunting 2,200 miles and demanded incredible endurance, as travelers braved vast grasslands, harsh deserts, and rugged mountain ranges, most of it while bouncing along in a covered wagon. Although the primary path wound toward Oregon City, plenty of settlers split off toward California or Utah, seeking opportunities elsewhere. For nearly half the year, wagon trains dotted the landscape, winding their way westward, packed with hopeful families, determined farmers, eager miners, and adventurous ranchers, all chasing the promise of a better future. These pioneers, often called immigrants at the time, followed a strict daily rhythm. Life on the trail meant waking before dawn, usually by 4 in the morning, to spark up the first fire of the day. That fire wasn't just for comfort, it was essential for survival and started every morning's routine. The first meal was always practical, designed to keep everyone moving. Thick slices of bacon provided protein and precious fat, while cornmeal hoe cakes or johnny cakes supplied the carbohydrates needed for the trek. Traveling the Oregon Trail was more than just a long walk into the unknown. It was a journey fraught with peril at nearly every step. Disease was the most persistent threat. Contaminated water was a breeding ground for cholera, which could sweep through a wagon train with deadly speed. Children especially fell victim to illnesses like dysentery, measles, mumps, and smallpox, all of which spread quickly in the cramped quarters of camp life. Exhaustion, exposure, and malnutrition only made things worse, weakening immune systems and leaving everyone more vulnerable. Even food could be dangerous. Supplies often ran low or spoiled, leading to vitamin deficiencies such as scurvy, which left travelers weak and lethargic. Water wasn't always safe to drink. Some sources were contaminated by animal waste, while others were tainted with alkali, causing poisoning and severe illness. Typhoid, mountain fever, likely tick-borne illnesses, and mosquito-borne diseases like malaria added to the litany of risks. For women, the dangers of childbirth on the trail were ever present and often deadly, as there was little medical help available. The physical hardships were matched by threats from the environment and, at times, from other people. Harsh weather, blistering heat, freezing nights, thunderstorms, and blizzards tested even the toughest. River crossings were hazardous, with accidents leading to drownings or lost wagons. As settler numbers grew, tensions with Native Americans sometimes flared into violence, particularly for isolated or poorly organized groups. All these challenges took their toll. Many pioneers didn't survive the trip, succumbing to disease, injury, or exhaustion before ever seeing Oregon. Those who did arrive were often gaunt, sick, and nearly destitute, having sacrificed nearly everything to make the crossing. The dangers of the trail became legendary, a stark reminder of just how high the price of a new life in the West could be. Legacy of the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail stands as a lasting emblem of America's westward drive and the indomitable spirit of 19th century pioneers. This trail was the artery for thousands determined to build new lives out west, most leaving behind economic struggle, chasing the promise of land and hoping for a fresh start. These brave souls often traveled in wagon trains, forming rolling communities that offered protection and camaraderie as they crossed treacherous landscapes. Their journey was anything but easy, battling brutal weather, rough terrain, dwindling resources, and deadly diseases like cholera and smallpox. Despite the countless hardships and heartbreaks along the Oregon Trail, the journey left a powerful mark not only on those who traveled it, but on the history of America itself. Pioneers who managed to reach Oregon often arrived with little more than determination and a few salvaged belongings. Their journey was anything but easy, battling brutal weather, rough terrain, dwindling resources, and deadly diseases like cholera and smallpox. Yet through it all, their grit and determination never wavered. Conquering the trail didn't just change their destinies, it forged values, shaped stories, and created a legacy passed down for generations. Their epic trek stands as proof that the human spirit can overcome any obstacle and carve out a new future, even when facing the unknown. Life after immigration. Reaching the end of the Oregon Trail was far from the finish line for pioneer families. If anything, it marked the start of an entirely new set of challenges. After months of hardship, exhaustion, and loss, settlers arrived in Oregon's Willamette Valley and other frontier areas with little left but determination, and whatever meager supplies had survived the journey. There was no welcoming infrastructure. Everything had to be built from the ground up. Families set to work almost immediately, constructing shelters from logs, brush, or sod, often with the help of newly formed neighbors who were also fresh off the trail. Land had to be cleared for farming, crops planted as soon as possible, and livestock cared for, all before the weather turned harsh again. The skills and toughness gained on the trail proved invaluable as settlers faced threats from unpredictable weather, unfamiliar land, and the lingering dangers of disease and injury. In those early months and years, it was common for entire communities to band together, sharing labor, food, and resources. Barn raisings and harvests became cooperative efforts, forging deep bonds and laying the foundations for new towns. Over time, some families established prosperous farms and ranches, helping to turn Oregon into a vital part of the growing nation. Others branched out, opening stores, schools, or churches, and helping create the framework for civil society in the West. The resilience and optimism that had carried them across the continent became a key part of their identity. For many pioneers, the ordeal of the trail faded into memory, replaced by pride in what they had accomplished and hope for the generations to come. The hardships of the journey had forged not only strong individuals, but strong, tightly knit communities determined to thrive in their new home. Descendants today. The story of the Oregon Trail didn't end with the last wagon rolling into the Willamette Valley. Generations later, the descendants of those rugged pioneers continue to honor their ancestors' legacy in Oregon and throughout the American West. For many families, stories of their great-great-grandparents' struggles and triumphs remain vivid, passed down through journals, family reunions, and even treasured artifacts brought across the plains. Today, these descendants actively keep history alive by participating in reenactments, volunteering with historical societies, and supporting museums that preserve the memory of the trail. They help organize educational programs in schools, sharing firsthand accounts and leading students along preserved ruts or to historical landmarks. Local festivals and events often celebrate the pioneer spirit, inviting communities to come together just as their forebears once did for barn raisings or harvests. The influence of those early settlers reaches well beyond family pride. Their resilience, self-reliance, and sense of community remain woven into the cultural fabric of the Pacific Northwest. Many modern Oregonians cite these values when describing what makes their region unique. Qualities born out of necessity and hardship on the trail, but still relevant in today's fast-changing world. In a landscape that now thrives on innovation, agriculture, and technology, the pioneering mindset endures. Some descendants have even turned family history into new careers, becoming authors, educators, or historians focused on keeping the story of westward migration alive for future generations. As they walk the same land their ancestors once tamed, they reflect on the sacrifices and dreams that shaped their lives today. By cherishing their heritage and teaching others, they ensure that the Oregon trails endure. If you found this story interesting and want to learn more about American history, about nostalgic stories that evoke memories, check out other videos on our channel. We always strive to bring you the most engaging and truthful content. Our channel has a lot of growth potential, and your support is the biggest motivation to keep creating meaningful content. If you haven't subscribed yet, please help the channel grow by hitting the subscribe button now. It's completely free and helps you not miss any new videos from us. Finally, if you know someone who also loves history, especially American West history, and wants to learn these little-known facts, please share this video with them. As always, thank you all very much for taking the time to watch this video. Your interest is invaluable. See you in the next video.